Well, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to start with Practical Emotional Intelligence Stage 3. In this stage, we're going to cover empathy, and it's the 11th of December, 2016. Christmas festivities are in full flight all around Sydney, and I expect all around the world. So I'll start off by wishing everyone Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, and may you have a prosperous 2017. What we're going to do today on the agenda is cover emotional intelligence and just do a quick review of the 7MTF technology. Then I'm going to discuss empathy and how you develop it. And the two techniques that are very, very important are TOPDOG, and the second one, a new concept to practitioners of the Humm-Wadsworth / 7MTF technologies, which is clarifying questions, and I'll explain what that is in a few moments. Right, just to repeat, what is emotional intelligence? As I've said to you, what we're doing is, I like the Goldman model, which is a 2x2 matrix. You have self and others on the vertical, and understanding and influencing on the horizontal axis. And we've done 2 modules so far, self-understanding and self-influencing, and now we moved on to the others row, and we're going to be doing understanding, which is empathy, and then next month in January I'll do influencing with social skills. Right, the big message, as I've tried to say to people throughout, is people drive performance, emotions drive people, but temperament drives emotions. And the big thing I relate is that your luck and memory are very important in developing your success in life. However, what I do just relate to is a study of King's College of London did of 11,000 plus identical twins, and they're trying to work out what determines your success in life. And they said that 58% of exam success was due to genes and 29% due to teachers and schools. And as I say, the teachers and schools are exactly happy with this result, but in fact, what it says is nature is twice as important as nurture. And with regard to your personality, of course, intelligence is one factor, the various IQs, but then the other thing is your temperament, which is your genetic emotional bias. What traits do you have? And that's and why I use the Humm-Wadsworth / F7MTF is that my belief it's temperament which drives your emotions. So, and what emotional intelligence is achieving self and social mastery by being smart with your core emotions. And self-mastery is awareness and management, which we've covered in 2 previous webinars. And today we're going to do social mastery and talk about empathy. And the big message, again, I repeat, is temperament is much more important than your transient emotions. And my latest message is that in the same way the Humm-Wadsworth built on the work of Rosenoff, the 7MTF builds on the work of Humm-Wadsworth. So, just to repeat, the Rosenoff's original model had 5 components in it, 4 components based on mental illnesses. Rosenoff's great insight was they were all slightly mad, and we're on a spectrum of mental illnesses. He said there were 4, and then there was a 5th component called the normal. Humm and Wadsworth then developed the first personality tests in 1935, first decent one, and came up with their 7 components of manic depressive, autistic paranoid, histoid, epileptoid, and normal. Then what happened was in 1993, came up with new names, which was the mover, double checker, artist, politician, hustler, engineer, and normal. My idea was try to keep the first same letter, because when people were using the technology, they never used the full terms of like epileptoid. They said the person had a lot of E in him. Right. Then what happened was from June 2007 onwards, I started doing a lot more work on emotional intelligence. And earlier this year in 2016, I got with Bruce Lewald, who's an American partner, And he said, look, some of these terms in America won't work. So, and also, I'd realized that the mental illnesses underlying some of the components were wrong. And we came up with these new terms: socializer, double checker, artist, politician, go-getter, engineer, and regulator. And that's how the 7-MGF got started. Right. Things to remember, first of all, and this is important when you're talking about objectives, the 7 components are like a web. And they interact with each other. We have all 7 components within our personality, but it's like a web. And typically you have several strong, several weak, and several average strands. Right. The other thing to remember in terms of average is for each component, for 2/3 of the individuals in the population, they cluster around the average. You're within plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So typically what you'll have is 2 stronger components, but they might just be at the upper end of average, 3 around average, and 2 typically slightly weaker than average. That's a typical profile. People vary. Some people have 3 strong components. Unusual individuals have 4 strong components, but that's just what happens. So in terms of empathy objectives, the target is, when you're trying to work out someone, is 2 things. First of all, you're trying to establish the dominant components. As I say, typically people have 2 maximum. Often there's a 3rd one as well. The second thing you're trying to work out is how strong is the regulator come normal in a person's personality. The reason is that what you're trying to work out with the components is whether they integrate or conflict. Now, some naturally conflict. For example, if a person has high mover and high engineer in his, or high socializer, I should say, and high engineer in his personality, if I'm using the 7-MGF, the socializer wants to multitask, do lots of things, whereas the engineer tends to focus on one project at a time, work by it slowly, step by step. Now, those 2 conflict. And if the normal is low, the person tends to have a scattering of attention, tends to be highly impulsive. Whereas if they integrate, this person is basically a very enthusiastic team leader who gets things done by setting a project list and ticking them off. And they're very effective team leaders. So it depends on the level of regulator normal in the personality. Secondly, so that's very important. Then I want to say, I won't refer to it again, but in my book, the Humm-Handbook, Lifting Your Level of Emotional Intelligence, there's a very good section on combinations starting on page 107. The combination is important because what I do is I list off all these sort of strong common combinations and personalities, in temperament. And I talk about each combination, what the effect is of either a strong normal / regulator or a weak regulator. Of course, I'm using Humm terms there in the book. So that's the message. With empathy, you're trying to establish the dominant components. How strong is the regulator normal, and do they conflict? So let's go to the awareness. Now, the big thing about empathy, people now said there are 3 levels. There's cognitive empathy, where you sit there and try to work out what a person is by thinking about him. Emotional empathy, which is done unconsciously, and then what is called empathetic concern, where you almost move to compassion for the person. Now, in terms of the 3 levels, emotional empathy, the 2 group components who actually do this naturally well are artists, because they're naturally sensitive people. And believe it or not, people find this amazing, is go-getters, or hustlers, as I call them in the Humm. The go-getters, people say they like empathy. I disagree. They spend their time trying to work out what makes people tick. They regard that as how they're successful in life. And what they do is they do this emotionally. It's done almost at an unconscious level, but they sit there a lot of the time trying to work out what makes people tick, thinking about it. Empathetic concern, okay, that's the realm of the double checker. These people are very agreeable, but they're very naturally compassionate and sympathetic. And that's why you find them in professions very commonly in things like nursing, teaching. These people and they're very loyal, one to their family, and secondly to their jobs, and they show a lot of, as I say, empathetic concern. I'm not worrying about those two. I'm just going to talk about cognitive empathy, and I'm going to try to give you a system for systematically looking at people. So this is a great system, for example, people like engineers who don't naturally have people skills. They don't. They're very focused on getting tasks done, and they're very effective at it, but they're not people, right? So there's two techniques that I want to talk about today. One I've only recently learned myself. One of the big messages in both my empathy selling book and the Humm handbook is that you can systematically look at people in terms of six factors. One, how they talk. Second, the organization they work for. Organizations tend to have dominant cultures. For example, engineers like to work in consulting companies. Double checkers like to work in companies which basically, as I said, like professions, basically like nursing or teaching. The position in your organization, I mean, politicians rise to become managers. Go-getters tend to work in sales. Double checkers tend to work in administration. Regulators tend to work, again, also administration. An area now is human resources. This used to be the realm of people who were either socializers or artists, but now, in fact, it's the realm of, because there's so much compliance work in human resources now, that the regulators have risen to the top. Dress is a very, very good clue to a person's temperament. Also their office, and as I said in brackets here, the home or the car, another great clue. And finally, the gambit. When you first meet someone, two things, where you've arranged a meeting with someone, are they late for the meeting? If they're late for the meeting, it's a good chance they're either a mover or a socializer, and also a politician. And then how soon do they use and then the other components tend to be on time. All right, if they then, for example, they're late for the meeting, if they apologize, then quickly move to using your first name, and they use your first name, highly likely they're a socializer / mover. Whereas if they don't use your first name and are quite formal in their manner, it's highly likely that they're a politician, and they wait some time before trying to work out their status. The second factor is what I call clarifying questions. This is quite interesting. I ran a webinar earlier this month for Michael Chen and about 12 of his trainees who are certified trainers who work for various organizations, and they're training people in empathy selling and practically emotional intelligence for managers. And one of the questions I was asked is, why don't you talk about clarifying questions in your book? And of course, my immediate reaction is, what's a clarifying question? I'd never heard of the concept. And what happens is, and what Michael's developed is this technique of saying to people, well, when you think you've recognized a dominant component in someone, ask them a clarifying question. Ask them a question that sort of pins down the component. And I thought, what a brilliant idea. I'd never actually ever thought of it. So thank you, Michael, and the Chinese team. You've now made your contribution to the Humm-Wadsworth's 7 MDF technology. But what it got me thinking, and I thought, well, you can think of lots of clarifying questions would work. But what I thought I would do, and I've done in this talk, is I've gone to the original Humm-Wadsworth paper that was published in 1935. And at the back of that paper, okay, there's the 318 questions that make up the Humm. And what happens is, some of the questions have no value, but a number of the questions, they value the thing in terms of the 7 components and actually weight it, right, from a value, I think from 1 to 4, how important that component is. And if a person answers yes to the question, for example, and it's a D1, they give them 1 tick in the D box. But if it's a D4, they give them 4 ticks in the D box. And of course, what you're doing with the Humm-Wadsworth, all personality tests using factor analysis, as you got a set of questions that relate to the factor. You norm the question by the personality test by giving it to 10,000 people. And then you say, right, for the N component, let's say it's, as I said, 318 questions. There's 7 components, say, 40 positive reactions. And let's say the maximum score you can get is like 50. And they say, right, well, the average mean score is 22. and the standard deviation is 4. That's what happens. That's when you norm a question. So what I've gone through is looked at the clarifying questions and then said, right, which are some of the ones that Humm-Wadsworth said these were very important. It's interesting. So I just did this as a help to the exercise. So let's go to the first one. Okay, go-getters. Right, go-getters, for example, in terms of their talk, the 2 big clues that come in conversation with the go-getters is the first thing is money. They're very easy with money and they talk about it. And the classic thing in Sydney, for example, is everyone talks about property prices, right? So you've got to be careful because it's such a popular topic that you might think someone's a go-getter when in fact. But the other thing that go-getters do is they name drop. They immediately ask you, do you know X? Do you know Y? So money and name dropping are 2 big clues. Organizations, well, the big thing about go-getters, they're dealers, right? And they're buying and selling. Classically, they work for wholesalers, or they act as brokers, or they act as agents. So, the stockbroking community, lots of go-getters, right? Real estate, lots of go-getters, right? Another clue with them is dress. As I always say, the 2 giveaways are the color red and gold. They tend to wear gold accessories, Rolex wristwatches. You think, talking about China, you think Hong Kong. Hong Kong is the hustler city par excellence, right? Everyone drives around in sort of Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Rolls Royces. They never go more. Well, they do now, of course, because they can cross the border into China. But it was, they used to only go just cross the road from Kowloon to Hong Kong. But the dresses, and for Australia, for example, you can tell the age grows as you move up the coast. Melbourne is quite staid, except around Collins Street. Sydney, Double Bay is the hustler area, but the Gold Coast, all the women have gold handbags, have gold shoes, lots of gold necklaces. The guys all have gold necklaces. The men all wear red ties. You see lots of red and lots of gold. Right? The offices are very showy and glitzy. Fake Marnard is one of my other standard lines, but it's a very showy, glitzy office. The personal assistants all very attractive, short skirts. Right? Gambit, they're generally on time. I worked for one of the more famous go-getters in Australia, a guy called Rennie Rivkin, who was stockbroker of the year for 3 years. Very interesting character. Great comment of Rennie. It was, okay, winners are on time, losers are late. He was never late for a meeting. I mean, well, not that often. What he would do is during a meeting, he'd be there and think, well, you've got half an hour. And after 10 minutes, say, I'm not making any money here. And he'd walk out. Right? Okay, because he was very focused on one thing only. It was how much money he was going to make. So that classically is the sort of levels of the go-getter. Clarifying questions. These are 3 that came up, and I just put this because I never thought to ask, but it's interesting. Have you ever been so amused at the cleverness of some crook that you'd hope to be acquitted? This is because go-getters basically skirt the edge of the law. And they said, right. And following up that is a man who provides temptation. These are actually from the Humm-Wadsworth questionnaire, so the original one. Is a man who provides temptation by leaving valuable property unprotected, as much to blame for its theft as one who steals it. Now, a go-getter, hustler, the old terminology, would say yes. Okay, if a person leaves someone available, it's their fault, right? And then, of course, again, another great question. Do you enjoy a race or game more keenly when you bet on it? I mean, if you're I play golf, right? You can always tell the go-getters, they say, we're going to have a side bet. The first question is the golfer, they'll say, what's this? Oh, they'll just say it. Let's assume we're going to be playing for something. What's the side bet? That's the first question they ask. So those are 3 interesting questions. And it's the skirting of the edge, playing a game for money, playing for money, all help. Anyway, I hope that gives you some ideas. I mean, there's other questions you can ask, of course. I mean, are you married, right? And if they say they're divorced, good attempt. You immediately, your go-getter flag goes up. What sort of car do you drive? I have a Lamborghini. Your go-getter flag goes up, right? Okay. So, I mean, it's they like to be seen. Well, I mean, one of the most amusing things I've ever done is we went to Saint-Tropez, my wife and I, and we stayed, I'm trying to remember, it's the beach. But anyway, there was this place called Club 55, where every social climber in France was there. I mean, the car park, I would have said there were probably, okay, let's say I had a place for 100 cars. There were probably 30 Ferraris, at least 20 Lamborghinis. There was a lot of Lotuses. Okay, I mean, the poor people who were driving Porsches, all were red or all were gold. It's very funny, right? It's just there, and you know, it's just amazing, and it's just filled with these, you know, multi-million-dollar yachts owned by Russian billionaires. And you definitely looked at them and said, I'm not a member of the 1% when you saw them. Anyway, okay, that's, as I said, lots of other questions, but these are three good questions that you think about it, and it's a nice one, etc. I think probably the last one is a very good one, the question to ask of the three. Right? Okay, let's not talk about regulators. What we're doing, by the way, is going down using GRASPED, G-R-A-S-P-E-D. So regulators, their talk is very logical, very rational, and that's the way. And they use reference cells. Organization, they tend to work for professional organizations, lawyers, accountants, and similar in companies. That's their position. They're sort of, you know, company secretaries, accountants. They work in finance. Dress is very conservative, pinstripes. Their colors are black, white, and gray. Their offices, I don't know how they do it, are incredibly neat and tidy, very, very clean, right? And the gambit is they're generally, as I say, punctual and on time and very formal. They don't, it's sometimes, they like to exchange business cards. They like to start meetings with agendas. They like to finish meetings with action plans, right? Clarifying questions for a normal is, clarifying questions is okay. I thought these were quite interesting. Does your life proceed evenly and on the whole without ups and downs? Right. I thought that was a very, very interesting question, and that's how, you know, a regulator works. The essence of a person regulator is their neuroticism is low. Right. They're very much in self-control. So that's how they would see their life, being on the evening without ups and downs. A very, very good question. Secondly, have you at times been among the last to abandon a lost cause? Now that, I would think, would have been for a politician. I looked at it, but then I thought about it some more and said, no, that's actually a good question. Because what happens with regulators is they logically work out an answer. And if they've logically worked out the answer, they can be quite tenacious when they hold it, and they're very much into precedent. So once they've worked out a solution to a problem, they tend to stick to using it, right? And then another one, again, very good questions, right? Have you lost out on undertakings by not making up your mind quickly enough? Now, you would tend to think, if you answered yes to this, right, that would be a double checker because they see the risk. However, right, because the regulator thinks very logically working his problem and tries to develop the criteria, then come through it, they can actually be quite slow in their decision making, and they want to ask the advice of other people. And of course, this is, you know, where do you find lots and lots of regulators? Well, you find them in big companies, right? Because big companies are sort of bureaucratic. That's just the way they work, and they have to set up processes and procedures. And that's what happens with the regulator. Have you lost out on several undertakings by not making your mind quickly enough? If you answer no, right, to that question, because you say no, I didn't lose out on surgery. I made the right thing. I hadn't worked out every mind. I was carefully considering the alternatives, making sure I came to the correct decision. So that's not a problem. I didn't lose out, right? So other people will say yes, where they happen to. Most people would answer yes to this question, particularly if you were a double checker. But a regulator will say no. I didn't lose out. I didn't make my mind quick enough. If I don't have enough time to make up my mind in a logical, rational fashion, I'm not interested. So it's a very interesting question. As I said, this clarifying questions, I never thought about it, but it's actually, as I said, you never stop learning, right? And so I thought that was a very, very good one for as I said, questions for a regulator. Now let's talk about artists. Okay, the great thing about artists that talk is they tend to talk behind their hands and they mumble. They're inarticulate. And those who've been on my courses, of course, I talk about Richard Branson being a person who's got a lot of artists in his temperament. And I discussed a report in an article and talking about it. To talk about them, they're articulate. They tend to work in creative organizations, advertising, etc. They're also in design. I always think of the TV series Project Runway as the one. Position, well, as I said, again, they work in design. All those people who work on Project Runway, for example, you see the various contestants, all of them have A. And how do you recognize them? First of all, they don't talk forcefully and strongly, or a lot of them don't. And secondly, the dress is, is very creative. It's oddball. Their offices tend to be very tasteful, right? And again, they tend to be on time for meetings. They're punctual, but they're pretty formal, right? And again, they have, again, if you look at the clarifying questions of the artists, okay, when you go to a party, are you more likely to sit by yourself or just with just one other person than join in with the crowd? That's very much the artist way, right? Secondly, do you find it hard to make talk when you meet new people? And that's a good question. Do you limit yourself to a few close friends? All right. And then finally, are you apt not to give your opinion at a meeting unless you are asked for it, even when you do not like the way things are going? Now, these 4 questions here really grab to the essence of an artist. Okay. They're not sociable, right? As I said, that's the thing. They like to sit alone and think and contemplate. They're visual, not verbal. So again, they're not fluent talkers. They actually can be quite good at writing, okay, when they're on their own. So they can be fluent verbally, okay, but they're not fluent orally, right? And they tend to have not many acquaintances, a few very good close friends, and are apt, as I said, not to give your opinion in a meeting when asked for it, even the way things are going. What can happen, you think that you've convinced them in a meeting, and in fact find out they haven't changed their mind because they tend to be very passively stubborn. Then we come along to socializers, of course, very much the difference in artists, and it's an interesting combination when someone has a mover and artist together, because again, there's a conflict. The mover is highly sociable, the artist is basically far less so. And again, it depends on the level of regulator in their personality, whether they integrate and become a very nice person, sensitive new age guy, or they become basically, they have conflict and they have issues and they swing backwards and forward. Anyway, movers, of course, socializers talk very easily. They're friendly and jokey. Retailers, fast food outlets are filled with socializers. They love working on the front counter, meeting lots of people. They're dressed as casual, bright colors. As I say, yellow is the color of the socializer. Oh, I always say, think of a McDonald's advert and you're well on the way. Their offices tend to be a mess, colored files, slogans on the wall. Generally late for meetings because they get distracted on the way there. But when they arrive late for the meeting, they then apologize and are friendly. So that's a sort of the way you can analyze a socializer. In clarifying questions, yet again, as I said, it was very interesting. Again, this I found fascinating when you sit there. Are you apt to become impatient when someone insists on telling you how to do work with which you're familiar? And I thought, it's funny, but then I realized because they want to move on, they're impatient. I mean, socializers are impatient people. They want like quick answers, quick solutions. Do your worries seem to disappear when you get with a crowd of friends? That's because the quality of a socializer, the trait is extroversion, so you tend to be spending time talking to people. Do you frequently ask other people for advice? Again, you'd think that would be like a double checker or a regulator, okay? But in fact, this came up, and of course the reason is socialists like to communicate with people. And asking people for their help is one of the best ways you get along with them. Okay. Have you ever been snapped out of a spell, which is when you're feeling when something exciting has happened? I.e., that's what happens with socializers. They're not often in a low patch. They're generally enthusiastic about life and quite etc. But they do have periods, okay, when they basically do feel low. And then something exciting turns up and they get snapped out of the spell. So again, interesting questions. As I said, probably the second one, do you worry seem to disappear when you get with a crowd of friends, is a good question. I mean, and you're asking someone whether they think they're patient or impatient, right, is a good one. But there's a good, as I said, interesting questions. And as I said, these are taken from the questionnaire, right? Politicians. Well, politicians, as I say in my courses, suffer from eye strain. I did this, I did that, I did this. They tend to like working in big organizations. That's, you know, etc. And I always find, of course, it's ironical. Our biggest mineral resources company in Australia, one of the biggest in the world, is BHP, Scotland. And I always say the most important thing when you're dealing with BHP is the P at the end. Ditto, our biggest life insurance company is AMP. And again, it's basically the important thing when you're talking to people from AMP is remember the P, right? The people who become managers generally have a lot of politician in them. Simple reason, politicians can make decisions. They can make decisions quickly, and because they're verbal, not visual, that when you ask them why they made that decision, can articulate a very, very good reply. They tend to be power dressers. Blue is their color, right? Their offices are typically big, the most prominent position in the building, and they have degrees on the wall. And they're generally late for meetings. They want to know you to know who is important, and they're generally formal. I remember someone telling me he was at a big conference in Indonesia where there were a lot of world leaders, etc. And Megawati Sukarno is supposedly unbelievable amount of P in her. And she did not enter the room until everyone else was in the room and seated. And then she came in, making a grand entrance. And he said this is in front of something like 100 world leaders. And or maybe it was an ASEAN conference, I don't know. But the big message was that everyone else had to be seated down. And then she came in. Of course, everyone then stood up. He said it was just amazing. And she wouldn't move until everyone was sitting down. So it was just a question of basically, and that's people who tend to rise to the top. They focus on getting there, and they're very articulate, and they can make the decisions doing it. Right. And then if we talk about the clarifying questions, well, when someone expresses an incorrect belief, do you try to correct them? I mean, I had to smile in there. Have you often found people jealous of your good ideas just because they had not thought of them first? That's exactly what a politician would think. Of course, they often steal other people's idea. In the last newsletter I sent out, I had this great cartoon. You know, I know it was your idea. The boss is telling the employee, but it was my idea to use your idea. Right. Were you at some time in your life aspired to a program or advancement of duty, which you've since consistently followed? This is a very, very good question. This is what happens with politicians is when they come up and they tend to find something which they believe in, they tend to believe it then for the rest of their life. They're very fixed. It's hard to change them. Once they've had fixed opinion, they won't sort of give up. And then this one I thought was a humdinger of a question. Have you often had to take orders on work from someone who didn't know as much about it as you did? Now, even in fact is they do more than you. The politician thinks that they know everything, right? Right. So it's a fantastic question. So that's how politicians would actually sort of think about when they're working. You know, after doing something for a week, they naturally think they're an expert at it, and then anyone else wouldn't know as much as they would. I'm just saying this. I said these questions were developed in 1935. But of course, you know, human beings have been human beings for thousands of years. It's just fascinating that some of these questions they come up with. I looked at that when I could not stop laughing, because that's very, very classically how a politician would think, right? Engineer. Okay, engineers, these are the builders, people who are task oriented. Their talk is monotonic. They tend to talk about the same things consistently. Organization, they tend to work, as I see life as very commonly found in builders and developers, and they work also as consultants. Dress, well, one of the ones I give away is they got the pens in the pocket. They're the people with the latest gadgets, you know, the smartphone. for a while when you had the Bluetooth earpiece. They were the ones who always had the Bluetooth earpiece. All right, their office whiteboards, full bookshelves. I really like to read about something. And then finally for meetings, they tend to be on time unless they've got distracted. They're also friendly and congenial, but they're not people. They're task orientated. Again, so we get in terms of the clarifying questions, right? Very, very good question, this one. Do you prefer to think things through step by step rather than seek a broad general view of the situation? The answer to that is yes. You probably got an engineer. Another thing, is it always a good thing to be frank? Again, because they don't worry about people, they tend to be frank and outspoken. I mean, people with low artists are also like this, of course, but it was just one of the questions that came up with. Okay, can you again, this is another question. Can you usually think things out in broad general terms, leaving details to take care of themselves? If your answer to that is no, right, that's a high indication of engineer. They want to get into the details and they want to read about it, and they don't leave the details to take care of themselves. They know that the devil is in the detail when you're trying to complete a project, and understanding the details is very important. So you ask that question and they say no, that's a big flag that you're probably talking to an engineer. And then finally, when you're invited out to people you do not especially like, are you apt to make excuses for not going? And if the answer to that is no, that again, now I wouldn't have thought that would be a good question for an engineer, but then the more I thought about it, it's actually not a bad question at all, because engineers are actually indifferent to the people they talk to. They don't actually, if you said to them they don't like people, I mean, there are some people they wouldn't like, but they wouldn't make an excuse for not going. They would just go with the flow because they just see the meeting as another task to get through. So anyway, that's effectively the engineer, sort of good questions. And then finally, we get to the double checker. Okay, as I say, these people are hypochondriacs. They generally got something wrong. How are you? They'll generally say, I've got something wrong with me. Public service is where they love to work. I always say Canberra is double checker city. They're brilliant administrators. They're very, very good number twos, getting the job done, ticking things off. Also work in customer service. Excellent in that area because they worry about people and they want them to be happy. The dress is very conservative. I jokingly say brown cardigans, and someone said to me, well, you don't see brown cardigans anymore. And I said, you know, walk around the offices of a civil service, you'll see them. Burberry, I always say, is the classic, brown checks of Burberry. I mean, they like earth colors. The earth is safe. Office, they're magpies. They never throw anything away. Typically, there's photos of the family and the partners in the photo because they don't get divorced. They're very loyal to the family. And typically, they're on time and they're very friendly. In terms of the clarifying questions, the ones for double checker, are you sometimes so blue that life hardly seems worth living? Because the essence of the mental illness of double checkers, of course, is depression. Okay, and they're driven by the desire for security. And if they think life is insecure, they get worried. Do you often find yourself becoming downhearted, discouraged for no apparent reason? And then I thought this was a really interesting question. I mean, again, as I said, this is off the questionnaire. Have you any fault which is so much a part of you that it seems better to accept it than try to control it, than try to do away with it? So this is like they accept, there's something wrong with me, but I'll accept it and go on. So there we are. There's our introduction to sort of people, the concept of clarifying questions. Again, if you're listening to this, Michael Chen, thank you and your group. It was a new concept to me, and you maybe look at it, it's very interesting. So in summing up, all I've talked about in empathy is conscious empathy. Okay, as I said, the go-getters and the artists have a natural sensitive empathy, and then double checkers have compassionate empathy. But I'm not talking about those dudes. I'm talking about a system by which you can basically understand people. TOPDOG is a very, very good systematic way of doing it. And as I recommend to people in management or select situations, and I've used it all my life, one of the things to do is when you walk out of a meeting, systematically ask the questions, go quickly through the TOPDOG dynamic and say, right, I think the person's dominant component is X and possibly some H. as you can say, possibly a politician with a little bit of with some go-getter in there, and you say, right, let's just sort of work it out. How do they talk? Their organization, what were they dressed like? The office, etc. The thing you're trying to do is the other clue is heuristics, right? This is in the Humm handbook, is in the section on basically understanding yourself. There's a whole set of general rules that Chan and McLeod effectively developed, and finally use the technique of clarifying questions to sort of, if you think you've worked out what a dominant component is, ask a couple of questions to clarify them. Remember, what you're trying to do is two things: is try to work out the dominant components in someone, basically. Then ask yourself, in terms of the combinations, do they work well together or do they conflict? And then how high is the level of normal in the person? So do the conflicting components, will they integrate or will they fight each other? Anyway, I hope that's been helpful to you. I'll wind up the presentation now. And as I said, next month I'll be working on social skills for the 7 components. And again, as I say, Merry Christmas to everyone, and may you have a prosperous prosperous New Year.